You're saying that that famine looms on the horizon.
We're conflating a couple issues here. They're very real, but they're not interconnected. So let's start with the population issue. When countries urbanize, they have fewer kids. Well, China didn't really begin their urbanization program until 1980, which is about the same time that the one-child policy kicked in. So you got the world's most constrictive population growth policy in it at the same time you started the world's most rapid urbanization process. And so the birth rate today in Beijing and Shanghai is the lowest of any urban centers in world history, less than 0.8 children per woman. And it's been so low for so long that there are no longer enough Chinese under age 40 to have enough children to generate a new generation. So they've already changed the one-child policy to two-child to three-child, and now it's largely actually abolished. But it was too late, and there are not enough people who could have the kids. And of the people who want kids, they're all living in condos, so there's no space to have a kid. So basically, China concentrated 10 generations of economic development and urbanization into 40 years. And it's over. You can only do that once. And there's now no longer enough people to have a next generation. So on the demographic numbers alone, China will be gone by 2030. That assumes nothing else goes wrong. The Ukraine war is crisis, and China is the last country in line, so they suck up most of that. China imports 80% of the stuff they need to grow their food, so you have a disruption in agricultural markets or phosphate markets or potash markets. China sucks up the entirety of that. China is dependent upon access to other countries to sell its goods because it no longer has enough young people to buy them itself. So if the Americans decide to close the trade doors, that destroys China too. Everything that has worked well for the world for the last 75 years has benefited China. But none of it has been because of something China did. China was just fortunate to develop in that specific environment. And now it's ended. For a number of countries, that is going to be seen as a viable option, but it's not one for China. Because if they go to the southwest, they hit the Himalayas and they stop. If they go south, they hit Vietnam jungle mountains. And the last time the Chinese tried to go into Vietnam in 79, they were treated to the same warm welcome that the Americans were. They can't go out. They hit the first island chain, and they don't have the naval power to punch through it. If they go north, the Russians have been very clear, going back to Yeltsin, that we won't meet you with men in tanks. We're just going to nuke you. There's nowhere to go. And their problem ultimately isn't really about resources. It's about population and market access. So they can buy it so long as someone else ships it to them, because they can't control the high seas. They do have a lot of vessels, but most are very small with very limited range. When the Ukraine war started and the sanctions kicked in, especially the financial sanctions, and the Russians lost all their euro, gold, and dollars that were stationed abroad, they then bought nearly $500 billion of yuan assets, and were like thumbing their nose to the United States. See, we got other options. And then the day came that they needed to cash in some of those yuan assets to do things, and the Chinese like, no, that's all right. We don't want them back. And the Chinese discovered that they just lost $500 billion. So the Russians are just quietly now going back to euros and dollars on the black market because it's more reliable than dealing with the Chinese. I think there was an understanding when Xi came in 10 years ago of just how deep the problem was. I also think there was an understanding of how little China could do to address any of this, because you basically would have to crawl on the floor on your stomach to the Americans' feet and beg for dispensation. I mean, the scale of support that China would need from the rest of the world in order to continue its growth is immense. And the whole idea of the Chinese rise is that the Americans will, for some reason, pay for it all. Well, that was always kind of a reach. The Chinese are now in a position where the only way that they can survive as a nationality, forget even a country at this point, is to strike some sort of long-reaching deal with the United States. The Japanese showed that you can have a very proud, very successful country that can do this, because they cut a deal with Trump that was humiliating, but they knew it was necessary for their demographic, economic, and strategic survival. And then they cut the exact same deal with the Biden administration to show that you could do it with both sides of the political aisle. They're the only country that's ready for what's coming.
What is that deal?
Oh, it's a trade deal on Trump's terms. So every niggling issue in the relationship was resolved and hardwired into the Japanese system according to Trump American preferences permanently. Forget semiconductors.
What do you mean?
The Chinese have proven that they can't reverse engineer mid and high quality semiconductors. They can only do the low end and only with imported equipment. And that has to be codified into any sort of long-term deal that China, you're just not going to be a tech producer because we can't trust you with anything. These aircraft carriers, those go away. The intellectual property theft, that goes away. And you better figure out how to democratize before we write that system for you. Yeah. Now, this deal will never happen because the CCP will not allow itself to disassociate. But that's what would have to happen. For the Russians, I don't think it's possible. There is no way to have a Russia that is secure and to have Russian neighbors that are secure. And the Americans have already chosen to ally with most of the neighbors, even before the Ukraine war started. Russia dissolves in the first half of this century if it loses the war, and in the second half of this century if it wins. In the case of China, the northern third, the North China Plain, that'll probably descend into kind of a neo-Maoist tyranny, complete with the famine. And then the southern city-states from Shanghai to Hong Kong will probably become semi-independent and interface with foreigners for everything from technology to trade to food supply, which historically speaking is how they've typically operated.
What matters to Beijing, what matters to the CCP&G personally, is power preservation. And economic growth is no longer part of that conversation. It's about the politics. It's about the security lockdown. It's about setting the narrative. And to a degree, does that make China more dangerous? Certainly. But it also means that no matter what they do, China as an internationally diverse, economically wired country is not long for this world. And that means it's all going to be different for everyone in the not too distant future. Well, we now have the most robust sanctions regime in history on the Russians. And it would be a lot worse for China because Russia is a massive exporter of food and energy. China is the world's biggest importer of both. But I think what has really terrified the Politburo are the boycotts. Because here you have private citizens and companies who, without prodding from their governments, have just walked away from, $500 billion of sunk cost. There is no Chinese economic system without international trade, foreign technology, and market access.
What about North Korea?
North Korea is a black hole. No one really knows because everybody's spies have been killed, including China's. Nobody has good information for what's going on. The best guess, it is a guess, but it's the guess that's been passed to me from a lot of intelligence officials in a lot of countries, is that Kim Jong-un, the current guy, when he was liquidating his father's generation to make sure there wasn't going to be a coup, he discovered Twitter and started tweeting about things going on within the country in order to undermine other people's positions. And Trump assumed it was all about him. And that's where the fire and fury stuff came from, is Trump assumed fire and fury meant Trump, and it really meant Pyongyang. And so Trump was like, well, I've got a bigger button. I can have more fire and more furier. And the Chinese found out about the fact that the Kim administration in North Korea was trying to calm the Trump administration down, which was leading to a conversation, which was leading to a summit. And the Chinese kind of lost it. And so they drug the younger Kim to Beijing to yell at him. And when it became apparent that they couldn't talk him out of meeting Trump, they put him in a little kiddie chair, and then they put Xi behind his big imperial desk with a booster chair so he could lecture down to the wayward province. The Chinese loved it because it was very imperial. But Kim, on his way home, was like, call Trump, tell him that the summit's on. We're never talking to these fuckers again. The North Koreans do not like China at all.